A young man stands at the edge of the wilderness, about to embark on a journey that will define his legacy. This man, who lost his father at 11 and faced countless hardships, is about to become one of the most revered leaders in history. Despite limited formal education and numerous personal setbacks, he rose to command an army and lead a fledgling nation to victory. This young man is George Washington. But how did he transform from a struggling surveyor to the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army? And what made him the first president of the United States, setting the foundation for a new nation? Buckle up and get ready to dive into the incredible journey of George Washington. George Washington, the man whose name has endured throughout history, came into this world on February 22, 1732, on his father's property near Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia, one of the 13 North American colonies of Great Britain. His father, Augustine Washington, was a descendant of the landed nobility of Virginia and a prosperous merchant. With the help of the English Principio Company, Augustine held a number of tobacco farms and iron businesses in Virginia and neighbouring Maryland. On top of his roles as sheriff and judge of the peace for Westmoreland County, he was also an active member of the local militia. George Washington's family background, including his father's business ventures and his mother's authoritarian parenting, fostered resilience and independence in him from a young age. Augustine's various roles provided George with a multifaceted understanding of leadership, while his mother's strictness instilled discipline. Despite being commoners in the British social hierarchy, the Washington family's local elite status in the colonies provided George with the resources and environment to develop his leadership skills. His childhood in a plantation-owning family instilled a strong work ethic and familiarity with agricultural and business management, as he observed the bustling activity of plantation operations, from the sight of vast tobacco fields swaying in the breeze to the sound of labourers working the iron furnaces. George had a restless upbringing since his father, Augustine Washington, was always relocating his homes to better manage his financial interests. In 1735, the family relocated to a 560-acre estate on Little Hunting Creek near the Potomac River, a sprawling property where George could explore the dense woods and learn about the land. In 1738, they moved again to Ferry Farm, on the Rappahannock River, a strategic location across from the bustling port of Fredericksburg and near the ironworks at Okokie Creek. From his house, George watched as ships were laden with iron, tobacco and other goods, envisioning the global trade networks that enriched Virginia. In George's formative years, his half-brother Lawrence played a pivotal role. Lawrence, who was 14 years George's senior, attended Appleby Grammar School in England and remained a teacher there until he was 20 years old. They first met when George was about 6 years old, and Lawrence's stories of his education and military service fascinated the young boy. Lawrence had served as a captain in a Virginia company during the War of Jenkins' Ear, participating in the ill-fated assault on Cartagena under Admiral Edward Vernon. Despite the operation's devastating failure due to enemy attacks and yellow fever, Lawrence's valour earned him the role of Adjutant General of Virginia. He took charge of the Little Hunting Creek estate, which he rechristened Mount Vernon, providing George with a first-hand look at estate management and military life. The early death of Augustine Washington deprived George of a classical education, propelling him into practical learning and self-reliance. This loss forced George to mature quickly, taking on responsibilities beyond his years. George Washington's early schooling is mostly unknown, and what little he did acquire was probably quite elementary. He took private classes in elementary math and independently studied economics and business. Even as a teenager, he devoured books on philosophy, history, and contemporary literature, often reading by the flickering light of a hearth. Swimming in the Rappahannock was one of his favourite outdoor activities, and he was also a natural horseman, often seen galloping across fields on his steed. Washington later felt remorse for missing out on the chance to learn the languages of the day, French, Latin and Greek, which were indicators of social and intellectual status. Compared to his more learned colleagues and friends like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, theoretically and intellectually pillars of the American Republic, Washington's intelligence appeared quaint and dated. However, he was a smart man who could make things happen according to his own standards. Lawrence Washington's mentorship and the Fairfax family's influence introduced George to Virginia's elite social and political circles, profoundly shaping his leadership abilities and aspirations while expanding his opportunities. Lawrence's tales of military campaigns and social gatherings at the Fairfax estates offered George a glimpse into a world of influence and duty. Joining the Royal Navy was George's intended means of evading his mother's control in 1746, according to the older Fairfax and Lawrence. However, Mary ultimately cast her veto because she did not want to part with a helpful hand on the farm. George's dreams of becoming a sea captain were dashed at the age of 15. Therefore, he chose to follow in the financially rewarding footsteps of the rapidly expanding westward settlements by becoming a surveyor. He was able to utilise this training ability throughout his career by learning to recognise geographical characteristics both on maps and in the actual world. In the spring of 1748, his initial task was to assist the Fairfaxes in subdividing their expansive estates into smaller pieces for future development. He would begin investing in property within a few years, and by the time he was 21, he had acquired more than 2,000 acres. After Lawrence, who was 34 years old when he died in July from disease, left behind his wife and a newborn daughter, George would increase his property holdings in 1752. Upon their demise, George inherited Lawrence's estate of Mount Vernon according to their agreement. George had aspired to follow in Lawrence's footsteps and become a military officer. Therefore, his brother's death was a significant blow, both emotionally and professionally. In February 1753, George Washington was appointed Adjutant General of his native area with the rank of Major after influencing Robert Dinwiddie, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. Major Washington soon found himself with a full plate. The French and British empires each had sizable holdings in North America by 1753. French territory extended from New Orleans in the southwest to the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River in the north, while 13 British colonies were located along the eastern coast, bordered by the Allegheny Mountains to the west. The enormous Ohio country quickly became a flashpoint between the two empires as they each spread their influence. France started constructing forts on the contested land in 1752. In 1753, the British government gave Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie, a major investor in the Ohio Company, the go-ahead to construct forts in the same area, and told the French to get out. In November 1753, with a small group, the 21-year-old Washington crossed the Alleghenies on a diplomatic mission. Washington did his job well, attending to both his diplomatic responsibilities and his need to learn more about the area's topography and the level of French and Native American influence. The council modified his journal into a report and sent it to London in January 1754. The report informed British military plans to protect the Ohio country against the French. Washington organised a small militia to march to the Ohio River's forks and build a fort, securing himself a prominent position in these military preparations. He was advanced to the position of Lieutenant Colonel, a significant achievement, but was disappointed by his lower pay compared to regular officers with royal commissions. In early April, Washington embarked on a wilderness expedition with 160 men, but he soon learned that 1,000 Frenchmen had taken the fort the British were constructing at the Forks and rechristened it Fort Duquesne. Washington and his Native American companions established camp and summoned for more troops. On May 28, 1754, Washington and his men discovered a small band of French soldiers stationed in a remote area. The French surrendered after a brief gunfight. However, a Native American ally of Washington's allegedly murdered a French officer carrying a diplomatic message. In the colonies, Washington was hailed as a hero, but in London, authorities saw his actions as reckless. Washington hastily built Fort Necessity, expecting a French response. After his commanding officer died, Washington became colonel of the Virginia Regiment. He fought bravely on July 3rd against the French and their Native American allies, but ultimately surrendered. Despite the defeat, he gained valuable insight into the enemy's tactics. The disbandment of the Virginia Regiment left Washington without a command. However, his personal situation improved when he leased the estate of Mount Vernon from his sister-in-law and made it his principal abode. In February 1755, General Edward Braddock landed with 2 regiments of British troops. Washington volunteered as Braddock's aide-de-camp and marched towards Fort Duquesne. Braddock ignored Washington's advice to travel lightly. On July 9th, the British were ambushed by French and Native American forces. Washington bravely rallied the men, but Braddock was mortally wounded, leading to a British defeat. Washington was appointed commander of the Virginian soldiers after Braddock's death, but the lack of a royal commission continued to irritate him. He trained his troops for defence in Virginia. A severe illness forced him to return to Mount Vernon in late 1757. During this period, he began renovating the estate. In early 1758, he became engaged to Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow. Martha was outgoing and supportive, managing Mount Vernon in his absence. In July 1758, under Scottish General John Forbes, the British renewed their assault on Fort Duquesne. Washington played a crucial role in the offensive. His status as a military hero helped him win an election to the Virginia House of Burgesses. In November 1758, Washington's forces regained Fort Duquesne. The French surrendered and demolished the fort, and the British rebuilt it as Fort Pitt. This marked Washington's final move during the French and Indian War. Washington became one of the wealthiest landowners in Virginia after returning to Mount Vernon and marrying Martha on January 6, 1759. He focused on tobacco cultivation, which proved economically challenging due to market volatility and debt. Washington's heavy reliance on slave labour was another significant aspect of his plantation life. Over time, he came to despise the practice but continued to depend on it. Washington's experience during the French and Indian War fostered animosity towards the British government, setting the stage for his role in the American Revolution. The American Revolutionary War began on April 19, 1775, when militias from both the United States and Great Britain exchanged gunfire at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. By the time the Second Continental Congress convened on May 10th, with a primary objective of recruiting volunteers and militia from all around the provinces, Washington had already won election to the body. Many of Washington's fellow delegates sought his advice on military matters once he arrived at the Congress dressed as a colonel. On June 16th, Washington was appointed General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies, and the Continental Army was formed when the Congress took command of the volunteer army besieging the British forces in Boston under General Thomas Gage. On his journey to Boston to assume command of the Continentals, Washington was informed of the Battle of Bunker Hill, where American forces had demonstrated their ability to stand against the British. Upon reaching Boston, Washington endeavoured to impress upon his troops the notion that they were a national army, not just a conglomeration of state militias. He was dismayed to see that his army was undersupplied with gunpowder and had only 14,000 troops fit for action living in terrible conditions. He kept these shortcomings mostly to himself, fearing British spies. Colonel Henry Knox, a 25-year-old bookseller from Boston, and Brigadier General Nathaniel Greene, a Rhode Island native, became particularly close to Washington during this time. Establishing a professional standing army was a challenge for Washington. Recruits could only serve for a year before being allowed to go home, so it seemed as if they would vanish as soon as they were taught how to fight well. Washington tried to get the troops to re-enlist as he was about to lose his whole army on January 1, 1776, but by the year's conclusion, less than 10,000 had agreed. Washington considered recruiting black people to increase numbers. Initially he was concerned about arming black men, but after learning that Lord Dunmore, governor of Virginia, had pledged to free slaves who enlisted in the British Army, Washington allowed free blacks to serve in his ranks. Morale fell among Washington's troops during the first winter of the war due to the terrible conditions they endured. There was still division among Philadelphia's lawmakers about whether to proclaim independence. The publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in January 1776 inspired many to fight for freedom. On January 17th, morale skyrocketed when Henry Knox arrived after transporting 60 guns from Fort Ticonderoga. Despite Washington's shortage of powder for a complete attack on Boston, he managed to maneuver the cannon up Dorchester Heights in one night on March 4th, forcing the British to flee. Washington rushed to New York after capturing Boston, anticipating that General Howe would try to seize the city. Despite being severely outnumbered, he felt obliged to take a stand recognizing the political and commercial importance of the city. On July 4, 1776, Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, which Washington read to the Continental Army on July 8. The excitement was short-lived as 32,000 troops and 70 vessels led by the Howe brothers swarmed New York. Despite commanding 23,000 soldiers, most were novice recruits. Washington evacuated his soldiers from Long Island to Manhattan under the cover of dense fog. Forts Washington and Lee were captured by the British in November, sending the Continentals running for New Jersey. Washington's Continental Army was forced to flee to Baltimore. With General Horatio Gates and a few thousand additional soldiers, Washington plotted a daring operation to surprise 3 regiments of Hessian mercenaries stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. On Christmas Eve, Washington crossed the Delaware River despite a severe snowfall. The Hessians were caught off guard, leading to their surrender. Washington's troops had only 10 casualties, capturing 900 Hessians. This victory at Trenton was followed by another at Princeton, boosting morale and forcing the British to retreat from New Jersey. Alexander Hamilton, an artillery captain, became an aide-de-camp on Washington's staff in March 1777. The Marquis de Lafayette, a 20-year-old French nobleman, joined Washington later that year, bringing hope for French support. In August, the British advanced on Philadelphia. Washington positioned his troops at Brandywine Creek, but was outflanked and defeated. Despite the loss, Washington attempted a daring night assault at Germantown in October, which failed, but demonstrated the Continental Army's resilience. Washington spent the winter of 1777 and 1778 at Valley Forge, where the Continental Army suffered from disease, starvation, and frigid weather. Despite these hardships, Washington maintained leadership and expanded his power. The alliance with France, secured in early 1778, provided much-needed support. Washington's resolve and strategic insight during these difficult times were crucial in sustaining the revolutionary cause. Washington realized that his pleading with Congress for supplies had been fruitless. Despite the strain of battle, his physical presence at the camp rallied his soldiers, and Martha Washington's genuine concern for her men earned her widespread admiration. Friedrich von Steuben, a Prussian general, also arrived to aid Washington. Steuben drilled the army in line and column formations and started developing a drill manual that the United States Army would utilize for almost a century. By early March, Washington had 12,000 soldiers ready to go. The signing of an alliance with France in February 1778 significantly boosted the American military effort. British forces, now commanded by Sir Henry Clinton, were forced to relocate from Philadelphia to New York. Washington ordered General Charles Lee to attack the British at Monmouth Courthouse. Despite Lee's initial failure, Washington rallied his troops and turned the tide of the battle. The British shifted their focus to the south for the subsequent 3 years. Washington did not engage in significant battles, but prevented Clinton from isolating New England. In 1780, Washington's army was strapped for cash and supplies. Lafayette advocated for more French support, leading to a 6,000-man expeditionary army dispatched by King Louis XVI. Despite defeats in the South, Washington's leadership remained crucial. Washington admitted Benedict Arnold's betrayal, who conspired to give up the strategically important fort at West Point. In 1781, Washington led his troops south to protect Virginia. After learning about French Admiral de Grasse's arrival, Washington and Rochambeau planned the siege of Yorktown. The Allies succeeded in capturing British redoubts and forced Cornwallis to surrender on October 19, 1781, convincing London authorities that maintaining the American colonies was no longer worthwhile. Washington presided over the Constitutional Convention, laying the groundwork for the American political system. Despite differences with fellow Virginian planters about the need for a strong central government, he was instrumental in solidifying the United States. As the first president, he tried to reconcile Hamilton and Jefferson, whose followers had divided into Federalists and Republicans. Washington maintained neutrality between Britain and France during his second term, despite tensions and diplomatic challenges. Washington planned to retire after his first term but was convinced to remain. He issued a farewell address in 1796 pleading for national unity. His retirement was cut short when war with France seemed imminent. Washington was appointed head of the army but disagreed with President Adams over Hamilton's appointment as second-in-command. Washington returned to Mount Vernon, where he passed away on December 14, 1799. Before his death, he revised his will to free the 120 slaves he had bequeathed to Martha, who chose to liberate them on January 1, 1801. Washington is still revered as one of the greatest presidents and generals in American history, having played an integral role in several pivotal historical events throughout his 67 years. Washington's journey from a determined colonial commander to a pivotal figure in American history is truly inspiring. If you're interested in learning about another influential general who played a key role in shaping modern America, you might enjoy our video on Eisenhower. Check it out right here.